When Queen Victoria came to the throne, the weapon carried by her infantry was scarcely different from that which had been carried at the Battle of Blenheim some 130 years before. This, of course, was the flintlock smoothbore musket, colloquially and affectionately known as the Brown Bess. This weapon, in its various patterns, would see service until the early 1840s, when it was replaced by the smoothbore percussion musket. Such longevity of service would see its use in many hugely significant conflicts. The 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, and of course, the Napoleonic Wars, which ended in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. In this video, we'll discuss the background and history of this iconic arm, as well as discuss some of its characteristics, capabilities, and limitations.
Gawping at? Expecting to see Mackenzie, I suppose. Well, let me tell you, I've already taught him this material, and, well, he's still trying to digest it. Now, it's your turn. So, if I were to show you this, what would you say? Any Gordons in the audience? Any Gordons? No? What about this tune, then? No? No bells ringing? Right then. Looks like I'll have to be blunt about it. Right, stop that! Stop the giggling! Nothing to laugh about. Get a grip. I was talking about this. That's right. We here at British Muzzleloaders strive to always use historical terminology when appropriate. This being appropriate. So, get it all out of your system now. Giggling, laughing, chuckling, snickering. Because let me tell you something. That word is going to be used a lot. Now, you're going to hear references to it being pulled and held and thumbed. And you'll also learn that it's got a set of jaws. And certain patterns even have a ring. So, you've all been well prepared. Pay attention and enjoy the video.
Although perhaps not as readily relatable as, say, the SMLE or the Martini Henry when it concerns iconic British and Empire arms, the Brown Bess, in terms of longevity and sheer universality of service around the globe, was staggering in its proliferation. Evolving out of the plethora of patterns that existed in the 1600s and early 1700s, which was a time well before regulation and proper government control, the Brown Bess became the first major standardized pattern of military firearm used by British and Empire forces. This smoothbore flintlock musket, commonly termed a firelock in contemporary speech, existed all the way until the 1840s as a frontline weapon. There were, of course, a number of patterns that were developed over its service life, but fundamentally it remained as it was at the beginning, a peculiar British marriage of lock, stock, and barrel. The Brown Bess saw use all over the globe, from the winters of Canada to the deserts of Afghanistan, the forests of North America to the jungles of Burma, the plains of India to the plains of Quebec. Truly, there has not been a service arm with a greater service life. Perhaps, before we carry on, a rundown of the various parts found within the lock of a Brown Bess. Of typically heavy-duty construction when compared to, say, a sporting lock, the military lock of a Brown Bess nevertheless has similar components. At the foundation of everything is the lock plate. The piece that holds the flint was known as the cock. Now this example is from my Brown Bess and is of a later pattern. Thus the cock is known as having a throat hole or ring neck. The earlier style was known as a swan neck. A set of jaws was mounted on top. The lower jaw was fixed, while the upper was adjusted with a screw. The pan was mounted towards the front end of the lock plate. This held the powder for priming. The hammer was fixed to the edge of the pan. This combined a striking surface for the flint, as well as a cover for the pan. Today, this is more commonly known as the frizzen. The hammer was tensioned by means of a spring, this acting in combination with two extensions off the end of the hammer, which fixed it in either the open or closed position. The inside of the lock plate featured the following parts. The cock was thrown forward by means of the mainspring. This acted on a part known as the tumbler, which provided, in essence, the axle upon which the cock rotated. It had a number of slots milled into it, these being known as bents. These were set in two positions, half cock and full cock. And it was into these that the sear engaged. The sear was tensioned by means of a small spring. Holding everything together and mitigating the torque placed upon the tumbler by the action of the cock was the bridle. The lock was inlet into a mortise on the right side of the musket, where the sear interfaced with the trigger, firing the weapon. The origins of the Bess lie in an evolution from the latter years of the 17th century. From the early years of massed firearms, they had been relatively heavy, matchlock pieces that, for some types, even used a rest to support it while firing. This type of musket one might easily associate with the English Civil War and other contemporary conflicts. In actuality, by the English Civil War, the use of the rest seems to have diminished, and at some point during it, the use of the rest was discontinued. Firearms were becoming lighter and handier. Along with a lighter profile, new types of ignition sources and mechanisms were introduced. One such was the doglock, outwardly a flintlock with the characteristic cock to hold the flint, a pan cover wedded to the hammer, as discussed, more commonly known today as the frizzen, and for priming and safety reasons, a piece that was known as the dog. This piece held the cock halfway between the fully forward and fully to the rear position. It consisted of a catch with a large barbed-like extension that interfaced with a similar profile in the cock, which held it conveniently for the aforementioned evolutions. The true flintlock had almost arrived. The final step of this evolution came about with the replacement of the dog with a second bent, or groove, inside the lock, cut into the tumbler. Thus, the half-cock position could be gained without the added expense and manufacture of a separate dog. It's important to realize that these systems didn't immediately supplant one another, but rather were used in a semi-concurrent way, with the newer technology gradually replacing the old. It is also important to understand that the manufacture of these arms was by no means standardized. Many different patterns existed with slightly different features and profiles. Colonels of individual regiments being responsible for arming their units, and sourcing was done at that regimental level. This nearly bespoke method of manufacture was superseded in the early 1700s by what was known as the ordnance system. This was the first effort at creating a standardized system for the production of arms for the army. The first arm produced under this system was known as the Pattern of 10,000. Some small changes were made, and the resulting arm was termed the Land Pattern musket, to differentiate it from the Sea Service version. Today, we know this as the Brown Bess. Although on its introduction simply termed the Land Pattern, today we refer to this first model as the Long Land Pattern to differentiate it from the models and patterns that came after. The date of 1730 is generally accepted as being the introduction of this pattern. Here we see the characteristics that define generally this pattern. First and foremost was its length. The musket featured a 46-inch barrel. The caliber of these early pieces was a nominal .78. Especially earlier in the era, tolerances were very large, and bores of larger and smaller size were manufactured. The barrel was fixed in the stock by means of a series of small metal pins. The lock plate had a pronounced curve to its lower edge, giving rise to the modern description of banana-shaped. The shape of the butt evolved to incorporate a feature known as the handrail, with a cylindrical small or wrist. The stock was raised around the barrel tang and lock plate, and a larger section was included forward of the trigger and lock, which was known as the swell. This afforded better grip when leveling the musket. A small brass piece, known as an escutcheon, was inlet into the upper part of the wrist. Early land pattern muskets were equipped with a wooden ramrod complete with a brass tip and no forend cap. Later, beginning from the 1750s, this was replaced with an iron ramrod and accompanying smaller diameter pipes under the stock. This was also accompanied by the addition of a fore-end cap. These pipes numbered 4 and held the ramrod securely in place. The era of the simple plug bayonet was long gone by this point, and the weapon was furnished with a lug near the muzzle to secure a socket bayonet. The offside of the musket saw the fitting of a side plate, in effect a very fancy washer, to assist in securing the lock and its mortise with the use of the side nails. Sling swivels were fitted to the front of the fore-end and the front of the trigger guard. Thus constructed, the long, land-pattern musket served from the 1730s through until generally the American Revolution, by which time its use had been reduced to the arming of the grenadier companies of the infantry only. The next pattern to arrive on the scene was the short land pattern. This pattern musket apparently evolved out of a dragoon weapon, whereby a shorter arm was seen as more desirable to what were essentially mounted infantry. Gradually this pattern became the predominant, and by the American Revolution it was in the vast majority. As its name suggests, it was shorter than its older cousin, with a 42-inch barrel rather than a 46-inch one. Apart from that, there were few differences. Reflecting evolutionary changes that occurred with the long land pattern, the lock plate had become less curved. There were other evolutionary changes made during the service life of the musket, many of these driven by production economies during the American Revolution. Very shortly after the adoption of this pattern, the side plate lost its rounded contours and became flat. The second ramrod pipe became fluted or trumpet-shaped. In certain versions, the side plate lost its rear extension, becoming the shape of a lazy S. The caliber of the short land pattern musket remained at .78. The short land pattern was to soldier on until the cataclysm that was the French Revolution and the wars that followed in 1793. This caused a vastly increased demand for muskets. Something had to be done to allow for faster and cheaper production. Enter the India pattern musket. The Honourable East India Company, much like the Hudson's Bay Company in what would become Canada and later the British South Africa Company in southern Africa, effectively ruled parts of India at that time. To equip its own armies, it had patterned their own musket, dating from the 1770s. This pattern, when compared to the long and short patterns, was again shorter, with a 39-inch barrel, and was somewhat less ornamented. The finish was also of a lower standard. The side plate was a simpler version, and there were only 3 ramrod pipes instead of 4. There were other minor differences. A notable one, according to my references, was the reduction of caliber from 7.8 to 7.5. This simpler, cheaper alternative was exactly what was needed for an undersupplied British army at the time. Initially, the Crown bought a number of muskets from the East India Company stocks. These would eventually number to nearly 150,000. But by adopting the pattern as the service arm, which supplanted the short land pattern in 1797, the Crown placed its own orders directly with the trade. Resultingly, nearly 3 million of this pattern musket would be produced by 1815. This was the main infantry arm of the Napoleonic Wars, and, due to its production numbers, served on in this capacity until the 1840s. There were essentially 2 different versions of the India pattern musket. The first one, dating from 1793 and adopted officially as the service arm in 1897. The second was the pattern 1810. The chief difference lay in the lock. The earlier version had a swan neck cock. The second, or 1810 pattern musket, featured a cock with a throat hole, or ring neck. This was deemed to be of stronger construction. During a pause in fighting in 1802, after the Peace of Amiens, the British government decided to attempt to re-establish a higher quality weapon, aptly named the New Land Pattern of 1804. It featured a return to the 42-inch barrel length, which was held in the stock with keys rather than pins, and a redesign of the butt, dispensing with the handrail style and substituting a more modern contour. As well, the parts of the lock lost their rounded contour and gained a simpler, more workmanlike flat lock plate and ring neck cock. The arrangement of ramrod pipes was simplified, and there wasn't any furniture where the ramrod disappeared into the stock. It was as if this pattern was just not to be, for as hostilities began shortly after, this put a stop to continued production of this new weapon. The small numbers that had already been made were limited in use, if at all, to the Guards who were issued this musket for the 100 Days campaign which culminated in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Despite the peace that came after, this pattern of musket did not wholly supplant the India pattern. Its use in the first decades of the 19th century was still limited to the Guards, and perhaps some other specially selected units. So despite being a superior arm and easier to manufacture, the India pattern musket remained the service arm, due in most respects to the great many thousands that were still held in store. There was one seemingly noticeable exception to the ever-present India pattern musket, and this was the new land pattern light infantry musket. Coinciding with the training and conversion of the 43rd and 52nd into light infantry, a new musket for light infantry work was designed. This was a hybrid of sorts between the new land pattern and the India pattern, for it featured an overall lighter weight, a shorter 39-inch barrel, but with new land lock and furniture. Two noticeable additions were 1. A scroll-type pistol grip behind the trigger guard for more comfortable shooting, and the addition of a simple back sight to aid in the type of musketry expected from light troops. This new musket was nominally issued to light infantry battalions, including the aforementioned 43rd and 52nd, but also the 51st, the 60th, the 68th, the 71st, and the 85th. One wonders, of course, how the supply system was able to keep up in providing these specialty weapons to these various battalions while on campaign. My Brown Bess is of the India pattern and features aspects that date it to sometime after 1810. The salient feature, of course, that defines this is the presence of a ring neck cock. It was made by Ramsay Sutherland, a firm in the Birmingham trade, and dates from 1820. Apparently, this was one of a number of muskets ordered by the colony of New Brunswick for the militia. They were apparently set up by Ramsay Sutherland with surplus parts post-1815. The barrel features a peculiar type of treatment which renders a coppery color on the surface. All the remaining hallmarks of an India pattern musket are present: the 39-inch barrel and the 3 ramrod pipes, as well as the simplified side plate, the handrail stock, and the raised wood around the lock. The musket remains in excellent condition despite its advanced 200-year-old age. I consider myself extremely fortunate to have come across it. Ammunition for the Brown Bess was conventional for its day. It consisted of a paper cartridge containing ball and powder. The caliber of the Brown Bess was initially .78, but this was reduced with the introduction of the India pattern musket to .75. Regardless of bore size, bullets were always much smaller. Balls at 14.5 to the pound, yielding a diameter of some .693, are referenced consistently throughout the period. One important consideration is that despite the apparent disparity between ball and bore, there still could be issue with ammunition earlier in the era. There are records tasking colonels to check that ammunition fits the bores of their men's muskets that date from the mid-1700s. By the Napoleonic Wars, this issue was largely non-existent. The charge, based on multiple references, was between 6 drams or 165 grains to 6.5 drams or 178 grains. This allowed for priming powder, but is still far beyond what modern shooters would consider normal. The exact quality of powder might be a possible explanation, and there are references to it becoming much better as the 19th century wore on. Windage in the ammunition size was critical, as the ball had to fit down the bore easily even after prolonged firing, and the resultant buildup of fouling. My ammunition is made with a 69 caliber ball, with a charge of 125 grains, 5 for priming and 120 for the main charge. Recoil is noticeable, but not in any way excessive. There will be a complete video on the subject at some point in the future. The loading and firing of the Brown Bess followed a specific series of drills that were practiced over and over again, known as the platoon exercise. Now this is the subject for another video, where these will be discussed in detail, but by way of a simple, generic demonstration, the procedure was as follows. First, the piece was brought to the priming position, and the cock pulled to the half-cock position. A cartridge was withdrawn from the pouch on the right hip and brought to the mouth. The powder end of the cartridge was ripped off with the teeth, and a small amount of powder was deposited into the pan. The pan was shut with the remaining fingers pulling back on the hammer. The firelock was placed at the left side, and the remaining powder was poured down the barrel. This was followed immediately with the remainder of the cartridge, ball uppermost. The round was duly rammed home and then checked with 2 firm taps, after which the ramrod was returned. Following the loading, the firelock was brought to the shoulder. To fire, the weapon was brought to a position known as the recover and was cocked with the thumb. The musket was then brought down to the present, right eye looking along the barrel towards the target, and the round fired. Following on, the loading process was begun again, while the firelock returned to the shoulder. The process of ignition saw the flint held in the jaws of the cock fall and strike the hammer, or frizzen as it's generally known today. This essentially peeled small bits of metal off its hardened surface, which glowed red hot. These sparks then fell down into the pan and onto the powder therein, igniting it. The resulting flash and heat was passed through a vent in the side of the barrel, where it ignited the main charge, sitting behind the ball, propelling it down the barrel. Flintlocks are not perfect weapons, of course, and they can be temperamental, especially without care and maintenance. When they are looked after, they can, even with a heavy, clunky military arm, be very quick indeed. An important addition to the Brown Bess was the bayonet. Throughout its service life, the bayonet of the Brown Bess scarcely changed. Some 17 inches in length, it was of conventional, if simple, design. It featured the typical socket, with zigzag slot milled into it. This fit about the lug at the muzzle, securing it there. These 2 weapons, the musket and bayonet, formed a system that in fact dictated the style and character of the battlefields during the era of the Brown Bess. It's important to consider the reality of warfare in the era of the Brown Bess. British infantry, especially during the Peninsular War, have a reputation for exceptionally destructive and effective musketry. This may be the case, but as important was the character required to close with the enemy. The number of instances in which the French came on only to be stopped by a crushing volley, a rousing cheer, and a deliberate and irresistible charge are many. The defeat of the French Imperial Guard at Waterloo, at the climax of the battle, is perhaps the greatest epitaph bestowed upon the British Napoleonic soldier. Now, the characteristics of the Brown Bess, as with all smoothbore muskets of the era, did not lead to open engagements at long range. But it wasn't just a vehicle for the bayonet either. Here, a short practice was undertaken to see just how accurate the weapon was. 6 rounds were shot at 100 yards. The rounds were fired on my own time, and I was taking measures to aim as effectively as I could. As with all India pattern Brown Besses, there are no sights, and use must be made of the bayonet lug and the general axis of the barrel to attempt some degree of accuracy. As you can see, the musket performed relatively well. A good flint and solid military lock go a long way in that regard. This must be seen as an initial practice, and I must admit, my shooting skills with it have a long way to go. Getting used to the way one must look along the barrel without the benefit of sights to assist is a skill that I have a long way to go to master. One, two, three, 4, 5, 6. Not perhaps the best grouping. I've pretty sure I'm capable of shooting better than this. That said, encumbered by all this kit and clothing and whatnot, it just takes some getting used to. And I haven't put a whole heck of a lot of rounds through my Brown Bess, especially encumbered as I am here. This will certainly close up after some more rounds downrange. I thought it might be appropriate that some accounts of the use of the Brown Bess in battle might be read. The 29th Regiment was immediately thrown into open column, left in front, and instantly moved up the hill to attack the enemy, directing our march between the fire of both parties. Without halting, our left made a dashing charge, and after a short but desperate struggle drove the French off the summit of the position. We then wheeled into line, advanced obliquely to our left, and opened fire on the French reserves which were pushing up in support of their discomfited comrades. This decided the affair. The enemy was completely overthrown and fled in confusion, leaving the ground strewed with their dead, dying, and wounded, among whom was the colonel of the 9th French Regiment, and quantities of arms and accoutrements. During this affair, when we formed into line, our right companies were some way down the slope of the hill. We could see the French column moving up across our front, their drums beating the charge, and we could hear their officers giving orders and encouraging their men, calling out, "En avant, Français! En avant, mes enfants!" But our well-directed volleys and cheers of victory stopped their progress, and their shattered columns returned in dismay. The 29th Regiment took possession of the top of the hill, our colours being planted on the summit. At length, the French column of attack, which had pushed vigorously on, notwithstanding the well-served fire of artillery directed against them, began to approach us. We took no notice of them, but allowed them to come up pretty close to us, when our Brigadier General, Richard Stewart, said, "Now, 29th, now is your time." We instantly sprang to our feet, gave 3 tremendous cheers, and immediately opened our fire, giving them several well-directed volleys, which they gallantly returned, but we checked their advance, and they halted to continue the battle with small arms. We then got the orders to charge, which was no sooner said than done. In we went, a wall of stout hearts and bristling steel. The French did not fancy such close quarters. The moment we made the rush, they began to waver, then went to the right about. The principal portion broke and fled, but some brave fellows occasionally faced about and gave us an irregular fire. We, however, kept dashing on and drove them all headlong right before us down the hill into their own lines again. We kept following them up, firing, running, and cheering. At this time, our poor fellows dropped around us in every direction. In the activity of the officers to keep the men firm and to supply them with the ammunition of the fallen men, you could scarce avoid treading on the dying and the dead. But all was still firm. Though alone, our fire never slackened, nor were the men the least disheartened. Though by closing to the right we appeared to be no more than a company, we still advanced and fired, and the Spaniards moved up upon the left with the greatest bravery. It is impossible by any description to do justice to the distinguished gallantry of the troops, but every individual most nobly did his duty, which will be proved by the great loss we have suffered though repulsing the enemy, and it was observed that our dead, particularly those of the 57th Regiment, were lying as they fought in ranks, and every wound was in front. The guard halted and fired, I think badly. We returned the volley, ported, and giving a hurrah, came to the charge. Our surprise was inexpressible when, through the clearing smoke, we saw the backs of the Imperials flying in a mass. Two references come to mind that were extremely useful in the making of this video. Both are by the author DeWitt Bailey. The first volume, which is somewhat older and out of print, is entitled British Military Longarms from 1715 to 1865. And the second is a newer volume entitled Small Arms of the British Forces in North America from 1664 to 1815. Both are well laid out and easy to read. The style of presentation, in the latter in particular, will be most familiar to those who own his previous volume on British military flintlock rifles. I might make mention of a few historical notes. In keeping with a theme of the channel, I'm using here a representation of the 78th Highlanders circa 1815. Although the 78th did not fight at Waterloo, it had already had its first major action some 12 years earlier at the Battle of Assaye in India. Fighting under the same general, the Duke of Wellington, known at the time by his name of Arthur Wellesley, Assaye was a great victory in the building of British India, and amongst the honours bestowed upon the 78th was the use of the elephant in badges and insignia. It was, along with the other British infantry regiment, the 74th Highlanders, granted a third or Assaye colour by the East India Company. The 78th raised a second battalion in 1804, and this was maintained in the European theatre, while the 1st Battalion maintained its overseas service in India and Java throughout the Napoleonic Wars. For the 100 Days campaign of 1815, the 2nd Battalion was deployed as part of the Allied Reserve at Newport. I have chosen to use the various distinctions commonly attributed to Highland regiments in the field in this time, including the use of short gaiters to cover the shoes, and a leather peak sewn, or tied as the case may be, to the front of the bonnet. The jacket features the buff facings of the 78th and regimental pattern lace with a single green stripe. The buttons are simple affairs spaced singly. The remainder of the equipment is common to all infantry of the era, including ammunition pouch, here of a somewhat older pattern, bayonet carried on a crossbelt, the two fixed at the chest with a crossbelt plate of regimental design, and the water bottle, haversack, and knapsack. The bonnet is decorated with a rosette featuring an elephant badge, black ostrich feathers, and the battalion company tuft of white over red. For those interested, all this will feature again in another update to the kit series here on the channel. One final point regarding the equipment must be mentioned. There is some evidence to suggest that regiments with buff facings also used equipment of the same colour. Confusingly, there's also evidence to suggest that this custom was abandoned by the early 1800s. Now, I have no specific reference saying that the 78th wore buff-coloured equipment, but as a regiment with buff facings, there's no reason to suspect that they would be any different from any other buff-faced regiment, be them in buff equipment or white. And I must admit, in the interests of economy with the channel, I've left the equipment that I'm using in the latter colour. I'd like to acknowledge a few people and organisations who helped with this project. Thanks to friend of the channel, Toby, who was able to take some photographs at the weapons room at the British Army's Small Arm Wing at Warminster. And to Ewan from the Fort York National Historic Site, who, as well as belonging to other living history groups, assisted greatly with early 19th century platoon and manual exercises, as well as sharing a great many references and interpretation. Your help was greatly appreciated. Although more information will follow about the specific kit used here, I'd like to thank Peter Twist at Historical Twist for the excellent museum quality jacket. This was a lengthy and not inexpensive project, but as you can see in the video, well worth the effort. And of course to Sally Pointer, whose talent at making magnificent historical bonnets I have relied on consistently for projects featured on the channel. Thanks as well to Laurence from Shedtime Leather. If you're in the market to add an historical sling to your firearm, then I can suggest no better source. And last but not least, thanks to the Royal Armouries collection, who allow use of their stunning images from their website for non-commercial purposes. Well, I hope you enjoyed this introduction to the India pattern Brown Bess. Now that I've found what I would consider to be an excellent example of the pattern, we can develop this series and explore the many fascinating aspects of this iconic infantry arm. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. And for more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page.